it's really a pleasure to come and join us fellow Kenyans as we discuss these matters which are really of concern. I work in a space where we have also spent a lot of time thinking about this and speaking and presenting. And one of the questions I asked myself when I got the letter was, what more should I say? Because we have said to Parliament, but this provides an opportunity to be able to speak. I will not repeat the matters that Bilo has spoken to, but let me bring us to attention that as we speak right now, according to the statistics we have of 2021, 22 million Kenyans are below the poverty line. And therefore, when we say this, we basically, and that could have changed. In the last 2 years, a lot has changed. Incomes have not increased, if anything, and I have shared in the paper that I've presented. The incomes are actually on a negative growth. And therefore, we are not talking about some utopian institution out there. We are talking of real people. We are talking of Kenyans spread across this republic who cannot put food on the table, who now, because of the cost of the high cost of living, have to choose between medical care and school fees. And you would wonder, so should they worry about medical care now, or should they worry about the future of their children and their education and the like? And therefore, I needed to present that number. That 22 million number is an important number because then it puts a face, it puts a life of somebody in this conversation. And then the slow growth of incomes. I will not talk about so much about the cost of living because that will be the core of what I present. But one of the biggest challenges where we are is that incomes have not changed in the last couple of years. If anything, during the COVID period, and I was just looking at the budget speech that the CS read, earlier this year, there are very few Kenyans who are earning, even be above the figures that we basically increased the taxes. I think it was about 1.1%. So you have a very huge population for who earn much more. But even the incomes have not changed. And the report I'm looking at here is basically by 2021, we are on a negative 6% in terms of decline in incomes. I will not say so much about the dollar, but the dollar has a compounding effect. And therefore, let me speak to the things that we think are critical for us to think about. Public debt and debt servicing has been presented by Bilo, and I'm sure the CS will also speak. The question of in-year deficits, in other words, how deficits grow within the year, is a matter of concern. Mr. Chair, if I was just to just present and say that every year our deficit within the year has increased, say for 2021, 2022, 2022, 2023, where we had a negative 16% and a negative 5%. 2014, 2015, we had a 99% increase in deficit from 367 billion to 732 billion. The year we are talking about, 2022, 2023, 2024, this current financial year, as per the supplementary budget published last week, but we already have a 20% increase in the deficit from 720 to 864 billion. Unless we rein in the deficit problem, we will still continue to run with a public debt problem that we are unable to manage. And this is important because when you look at the trend, these are changes that happen within the year. Mr. Chairman, if our revenues are not performing, why should our expenditures increase? Why don't we rationalize our expenditures? I want to confirm to this honorable team that I don't think we have a revenue problem. Every year, our revenues have been growing year on year, an average of 10%. We have a spending problem. And somebody who is struggling with Fuliza, Tala, branch does not need more money, needs a behavior change. And therefore, it is important for us to rein in. Because what we are doing is that we are borrowing more and more and more. But where are we borrowing from? When you look at our debt currently, it's at about 50% each in terms of domestic to external. The debt servicing that we are paying, just one step behind, that whereas our debt is big, our biggest risk exposure is within the domestic market. Mr. Chair and co-chairs, I think this is a matter that we are not having a conversation on. This year alone, we expect to raise a revenue of about 2.5 trillion Kenya shillings. Let me bring it down. We expect to raise about 250 shillings in ordinary revenue. Our consolidated fund services, which includes pensions and constitutional expenditure, is 278, so 200 shillings. I'm just using average, it's 2.078 trillion. Out of that, our debt repayment is 1.86 trillion, 186. So do the math, 250 minus the 200, which these are non-discretionary expenditure. So they basically, it's a must pay, it's a must spend. Of that 180, 100 is to the domestic market. Now, why is the domestic market important? It is because a lot of that borrowing has been on double digit. 12%, I think the last coupon I saw was at about 15%. In other words, we are highly at risk because with all that money being held by government, what it has done is that government basically is competing with private sector, with private individuals in the domestic credit market. That is important because when you read the story of what has happened in Greece, in Argentina, recently in Ghana, then it is the domestic market, the famous haircuts, were taken in the domestic market. But why is it important? If you have only, and if you add appropriations in aid, it's another 400 billion. So basically 290 shillings in my simplified figure. What you're saying is that teachers alone will cost you 400 billion. In other words, if you just add teachers' salaries to the consolidated fund services, all the money in ordinary revenue is gone. You've not even paid for military costs. You have not done transfers to devolution. And therefore, I want to suggest to this honorable committee that we have a debt crisis. And it is important that for us to have part of this national dialogue is perhaps to start having a conversation on how do we restructure. I'm avoiding the word default. How do we manage ourselves out of this situation because we do not have money to provide public services? And we have tried to analyze, because when you look at expenditure in social services, you look at expenditure to county governments in terms of the transfers we are making to county governments, everything is on 0%. It's only debt servicing that is on a higher upward trend. We have a crisis. And the earlier we accept we are in a crisis, they say the first step, after denial is acceptance. We need to accept that that is where we are. Because if we don't have this conversation, and there's interesting, the former Greek minister of Greece for finance in Greece has written an interesting paper, and he said one of the biggest problems is that they kept denying that there was a problem until finally, in fact, the paper is called The Denial of the Greek Debt Problem. We cannot continue to say that we are sustainable. We are not sustainable. If we are to provide, something we'll have to give, and it's either public services or how we organize. I think I've executed that matter to the best, because as long as public services will suffer, otherwise we have to borrow more, because this deficit that we have now increased to 864 billion. Where do we expect to get the money from? We have to borrow more. High taxation. As a result of the kind of situation we have where the space, the fiscal space we have is limited, you then have to raise taxes. But who are you raising these taxes from, I beg to ask? Including the housing levy, which I still don't understand the concept. And I consider myself among the Kenyans who read public documents, perhaps more voraciously. And I still don't understand why you are taking more money from people for a concept. 80% of Kenyans, and this is the only thing I'll say on housing, live in their own homes. Have you asked them the kind of housing they need? I rest it there. High taxation, therefore, because of the situation we find ourselves in, the only option left is to raise more taxes. And when you raise more taxes, the group that you are targeting is only two kinds of individuals or legal persons. Is a corporate institution, a business entity, a premise that is registered, and that is providing a public service. Providing a good to the public, and therefore they purchase it, or an incomed citizen. That incomed citizen also has to pay taxes in terms of VAT, because income even includes a person who gets 100 shillings, in terms of their daily. And therefore, when we are thinking about taxes, would it be time to actually rethink the speed at which we are introducing taxes in a context where even the business environment is shrinking and incomes are not necessarily growing? I think here is a pacing question. And what do we introduce? Can you introduce all these taxes at the same time? But let me speak to the one on energy, because that is a critical one. Here, you have diesel that, of course, drives a lot of the IPPs in terms of energy, and I really thank Mr. Chirchir here, because he's really explained quite well. But that diesel already had been charged a tax, so almost one could argue, are we going through a situation of double taxation? But when you look at the taxes, and we did outline, just in the pump, and the EPRA has really provided. You have excise duty, you have road maintenance levy, you have petroleum development levy, you have petroleum regulatory levy, you have railway development levy, you have anti-adulteration levy, merchant shipping levy, import declaration fee, and value-added tax. And when you work out those numbers, you find that out of the 217, for instance, you will pay at the pump, 80 shillings of that is taxes. Wouldn't this be the best place, for instance, to say, given the situation we are in currently, can we pause? Can we give a rebate? Well, because why should the cost always be transferred to the consumer? Can it be the other way around? To say, can we give a pause to some of these taxes because of the state? Because we are talking about cost of living. Now, all this is compounded in the fact that in October, from the statistics again we have, 13% transport, there was a 13% increase in transport costs in terms of inflation. So that tells you that 13% in terms of increase, in transportation costs gets transferred to all our institutions. Finally, and perhaps to an animal that we have not given a lot of attention, I want to present that if we are going to manage the cost of government and the cost of living right now, we have to make a decision on what to do with state-owned enterprises. 25 to 28%, and I'm using that figure because we are here to confirm for now, is of MDA's expenditure is by state corporations. Those state corporations, the last count we have made, they are at about 248 of them. These are not the 48 county governments, neither are they the 22 ministries at the national level. These are institutions, some doing duplicate work in different ministries, 25%. Now, this, when you go to the budget, is also the space where we don't have very much transparency about what goes on. We only find figures when there is need for a bailout for Kenya Airways. I'm giving an example because it's the one, for instance, in the supplementary first budget here has an increase of 1.7 billion in guaranteed debt to Kenya Airways. It's in the books. And during the review, the stock risk exposure according to the BPS 2023, during the review period 2022-2023, the stock of risk exposure is estimated at 2.7 trillion, where 2.66 trillion is from state-owned enterprises. This is from the National Treasury report. So in other words, you are stuck with many structures that give you the highest risk with the least transparency. If you ask me, Mr. Chair, co-chairs, I think if we are going to deal with the cost of living, let us action on matters of how do we manage debt moving forward, including dealing with the deficits. Let us make a very decisive decision. What do we do with taxation that has to do with fuel, because that is being translated to every part of the economy. And let us action. There is a whole report on merging, selling state-owned enterprises. In fact, I think PBO and Bwana Masinde is here, did an estimate that if you were to sell, if you were to privatize some of them, I think will make about 30 billion annually. I rest my case. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Abram.
Thank you, co-chairs. I was asked two questions. One Bilo has responded to a bit, but first I was asked, is it true that 80% of Kenyans, I want to also encourage the PS for housing to refer to national statistics. He referred to documents by other people out there. We have a national census 2019, which is what we use. This is what it says. There are 12.1 million households in this country. They are divided between rural and urban. Rural are 7.4, urban are 4.7. 86%, that is 6.3 in rural, own their own homes. And that's the figure I was referring to. Maybe just to clarify that. Yes, 86. And if you had my comment, I was saying, what is the need in the rural areas for building houses? Because he said he has written to every member of parliament asking for land. I don't think even any MP owns land in the first place, public land, but that's a story for another day. And 21.3 in urban areas own their own homes. The rest rent. A good number rent. The question is, do they have a problem renting? Is there anything across the world? Most populations live in rented homes, rented houses. Of course, we have a challenge. Is a challenge actually that there are no houses or that people cannot afford mortgages? I think let's address the right challenge. And that's why I say I think there's still a lot to be discussed around the housing. I will not belabor that. What to do with, why say cut taxes on one side, and at the same time cut spending? Isn't it a contradictory? It is not. The reason for that is that the more we discuss this as purely a revenue problem, the more we get it wrong, in my opinion. Because we seem to say all our expenditures are right. I gave an example of the state-owned enterprises. If you go through the levies, a lot of those levies and rates are charged to maintain these state-owned enterprises because they have to get some money to keep them going, because that's basically what they established, and agencies. And in my opinion, I think that it will be of value to, first of all, remember those institutions, just to take us one step back, are also playing in this intergovernmental space where between counties and national government. Look at the number of them in the water sector. Look at the number of them, in the different frameworks, and we seem to be even creating more with the law. So there is a possibility to actually look at the efficiencies, and the Auditor General is on record, just flagging out expenditures that were not right. If you work on all those numbers, including the 2 billion that the current government has committed to confirm whether it's true that, as per the former president, that we lose 2 billion every day. If you do the math, if you were to cursory look at that figure, 2 billion per day gives you about 710 billion in a year. That gives you almost the deficit that we are talking about. So there are options, and the options is not just going and saying, let's raid this ministry and cut their expenditure, but it has to be a mix. Look at the tax expenditures, already some improvements there. That is the amount of money we give in terms of rebates. Why not go and reduce that so that we give rebates to Kenyans in terms of and the rest is what we've talked about, the fuel. Must we charge everything? Because we are saying we are not in normal times. Yet there is something we can do. The last question, which was about KQ, I think a lot of these state-owned enterprises need to run on a business model. You don't make a profit, you don't run, you shut down. we don't go to save every other company out there. We should actually be saving, because right now, as we hear of capital flight, we should actually be working to save that. So we cannot continue to save companies that are not performing, yet doing business. Kenya Airways, anybody who flies with Kenya Airways, despite the delays here and there, is fairly full. At least I have fallen. It's always fairly full. So I don't understand where the loss comes from, and it's the most expensive. Just to also say, so those are my thoughts, and happy to continue with this conversation. Thank you very much.